All right, welcome everyone to part one of the learning lecture. We're going to be focusing on classical conditioning today. We're going to finish up with just a couple other kind of miscellaneous forms of learning. So, we are going to talk about one of the big topics in psychology, that is Pavlov's dogs. So, let's continue. All right, so learning and memory are two topics that are usually covered back to back in psychology. And that's because they're very, very similar topics. So, memory is concerned with how do we retain information. Learning is concerned with how does that information affect our behavior. So remember, as psychologists, we're interested in behavior. Learning is simply how learned information influences behavior. So that's the topic of the day. And I want to start by talking about the difference between learning and instincts. So I like to compare the mosquito life cycle to the human life cycle, not lifestyle, life cycle for this little example here. So mosquitoes follow more or less a pretty strict path in their life cycle. They hatch, they mate, they feed, hopefully not on a person. They lay their eggs and then they die. It's a pretty short, pretty simple life cycle. And every mosquito that has ever existed on this planet has followed that basic template. Yeah, maybe one or two got killed here or there through various means, but more or less, that is what a mosquito is trying to do during its lifetime: hatch, mate, feed, lay eggs, and die. That is a life cycle that is very much dictated by instincts. Mosquitoes don't wake up in the morning and think, I think I'd like to read a book today, or I think I'd like to go for a walk. They don't do things like that. They are heavily, heavily influenced in their behavior by instinctual motivations. Humans, on the other hand, the human life cycle looks very, very different. We're born, one of any thousands of different things could happen, and then we die. The human life cycle is very much governed by um, the learning progress and stuff like that. So the human life cycle looks very, very different than the mosquito life cycle. And this is because they're governed by two very different principles: learning principles and instinctual principles. So let's talk a little bit about this question mark period in the human life cycle. What is learning? How does it influence our behavior? And why do we live such different lives than mosquitoes? So, instincts can be defined as strictly determined genetic basis for behavior. Now, the jury is kind of out if there are any actual instincts that humans have. Yes, there are definitely some behaviors that we engage in that have a strong genetic component, but free will does exist. And for the most part, humans seem to be more or less the masters of their own domain. They can choose to engage in a behavior or not. We have a choice. We can stop ourselves from engaging in one particular behavior. Mosquitoes, they don't really have that choice. They don't have that ability to fight their instincts. They don't really have the ability to think and fight their genetic motivations. So, learning, which humans have such an immense capacity for, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience or due to learned information. So, humans have an immense capacity for learning, which means we have an immense capacity to change our behavior because of new information, new experiences, new knowledge, you name it. So, this is kind of getting down to the nitty gritty of the nature versus nurture debate. How much of who we are is based on our genetic predisposition, and how much of who we are is based on our nurture, is based on our learned experiences. Well, if you ask the behaviorists, they would say it's all nurture. And the behaviorists have a lot to say in this particular topic of psychology, of learning. Behaviorists focused almost exclusively on learning. And today we're going to talk about classical conditioning, which is just a little bit before the behaviorists. We will talk about John Watson, who, if you remember from our day one What is Psychology lecture, he was sort of one of the first behaviorists out there. But behaviorism really took off when B.F. Skinner came on the scene and brought with him the ideas of operational conditioning. And that'll be part 2 of the learning unit. So let's continue. Classical conditioning. All right, what is it? Why did Pavlov get so famous for conditioning some dogs? So, in classical conditioning, we learn to associate two stimuli, meaning two stimuli occur together at the same time. And we learn to have the same reaction to both of those stimuli. We're going to go into much more depth about what that means, but that is sort of your blanket introductory statement about classical conditioning. We learn to associate that two stimuli occur together, and we learn to react to both of those stimuli in the same way. So what is a stimulus? It's one of those incredibly generic terms you hear usually in a scientific context quite a bit. A stimulus, for our purposes, is a thing or an event that can be perceived. Remember, we talked about absolute thresholds. So a stimulus has to be perceived, it has to meet those absolute thresholds. But a stimulus can be in any of our senses. So it could be a thing that we see, it could be a thing that we hear, it could be a thing that we feel on our skin, it could be a thing that we smell or taste. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Pavlov's dogs. I'm sure you've all heard of this incredibly famous experiment in psychology. Ivan Pavlov, was a Russian researcher, and he was actually interested in the digestive system of dogs. He was a physician and he was interested in how dogs digest food. And so he had these intricate mechanisms hooked up to these dogs that measured the amount of salivation that they had. And what he started to realize is that the dogs would begin salivating before they were fed. These dogs actually began salivating anytime the door to their kennel was open or the assistant walked into the room. So he started to put two and two together and realized that these dogs were associating different stimuli, like a door opening or someone entering the room, with feeding time. So they were learning to associate those two stimuli, those two events together. Anytime this door opens, I usually get fed. So my body is going to start to prepare for food, hence salivation. So this was sort of the light bulb moment for Pavlov, and he kind of ran with it. So he started intentionally pairing different events with food. The very famous example would be a bell. So Pavlov, what he did was he would ring a bell and then present the dogs with food. And he did this many, many times. And before long, the dogs were reacting to the bell just like they would react to food, which in this case means they would start to drool, they would salivate. So before long, all that would be needed for dogs to start salivating was just that little bell ringing. And that's where the very famous experiment comes from. So in that experiment, the two stimuli being associated would be the ringing of a bell and the presentation of food. The dogs are learning to react to the ringing of the bell and the presentation of the food in the same way, which again, in this case, is salivation. If you remember from the day one lecture, excuse me, we talked about little Albert. And little Albert was this poor, unfortunate participant in an experiment where he was taught through the principles of conditioning to be afraid of little bunnies. He was not afraid of little bunnies at the start of the experiment, but remember that the little bunny, as it approached little Albert, there was a very loud noise that was played, and it actually scared Albert. So unfortunately, he started to become scared of the little bunny because anytime that little bunny got close to him, then that loud noise would sound. So in this example, little Albert is learning to associate the presence of that little bunny with that loud, scary sound. So if that bunny is there, that means that loud sound is about to show up and scare me as well. So think about the second stimulus that occurs as like the impending stimulus. In Pavlov's dog example, where food is paired with a bell, food is the impending stimulus. It's almost like in classical conditioning, we're learning to prepare for the future. So the ringing of the bell signaled that food was on its way. So the dog started to prepare for food. In the case of little Albert, the presence of that little bunny signaled that a loud, scary thing was about to happen. So, what did little Albert do? He got scared. He responded to the little bunny just like he would to the loud, scary sound that was impending. If you'd like to see a video summarizing what Pavlov did with his dogs, I have it linked on the Canvas page. I encourage you to check that out. If you're unfamiliar with Pavlov, that's a great little brief summary of what he did. All right. Just a key little difference here I want to talk about is the difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So classical conditioning, this is dealing with involuntary behavior. And we're mainly looking at how we learn to associate two stimuli, how we learn to pair one stimulus with another, the ringing of a bell with the presentation of food, the presence of a bunny with a loud, scary sound. So that's dealing with involuntary behavior, reflexive behavior, behavior that we have no control over. Operant conditioning, which we're going to talk about next lecture with B.F. Skinner, that deals with voluntary behavior. And in this type of conditioning, you're interested in how we learn to associate a behavior with a consequence, how we learn to realize that a behavior usually means a particular consequence. But like I said, we'll talk about that later. We'll go into pretty big depth about that there. So let's get some terminology out of the way so we can start to talk about classical conditioning in more detail. And we're going to start with a neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus is a stimulus that does not elicit a reaction from the organism. So in the case of Pavlov, the bell was initially a neutral stimulus. Before the dogs realized that the ringing of a bell meant food was about to show up, ringing a bell didn't do anything to the dogs. It did not make them salivate more. It's a neutral stimulus. The dogs weren't scared of the bell. They didn't get excited by the bell. They didn't get hungry in the presence of the bell. It was a neutral stimulus. It did not elicit a reaction from those dogs. In the case of little Albert, the white the white bunny, I should say white bunny, that's talking about a different experiment. The white bunny was more or less a neutral stimulus. Little Albert didn't really respond to the bunny. If anything, he was a little intrigued by the bunny, but he was certainly not scared of the little rabbit. So, an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that elicits an unconditioned response. It is a stimulus that we do not have to learn will elicit an unconditioned response. So what I mean by that is an unconditioned stimulus is something that we don't have to learn is painful or something that we don't have to learn is pleasant. So an example of an unconditioned stimulus would be like a painful shock. A painful shock is painful. We don't have to learn that it doesn't feel good. Another example, maybe something pleasant, would be like a tasty treat, some type of food that we really like a cookie or something like that. We don't have to learn that a cookie tastes good. That is something we inherently know. A cookie tastes good, a painful shock is bad. Those are examples of unconditioned stimulus. And it might make a little bit more sense in context here. So, an unconditioned response, which we can abbreviate UR, an unconditioned response is a reflexive response in the presence of an unconditioned stimulus. So, let's go back to the painful shock example. Our unconditioned stimulus, or US, is our painful shock. The UR, or unconditioned response, would be maybe flinching in pain or crying out in pain, expressing pain in some way. That's our UR, unconditioned response. Again, an unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. This could be painful, this could be pleasant. Let's go back to our cookie example. So the cookie is the US, and the UR might be, well, we could use Pavlov's example. It could be salivation. We could find ourselves salivating a little bit. We could find ourselves being hungry. We could find ourselves getting very excited that we might get to eat that cookie soon. So again, these are reflexive responses. These are involuntary responses, automatic responses. Now contrast that with conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. These are stimuli and responses that have to be learned. We learn to associate a conditioned stimulus, a CS, with an unconditioned stimulus, a US. We learn to have a conditioned response in the presence of a conditioned stimulus. So CS and CR, these are the things that are not present at the beginning of learning, at the beginning of a classical conditioning experiment. The US and UR are present from the beginning. They are inherently built into our system. They are reflexive involuntary behavior. The conditioned stimulus and conditioned response, those are things that we have to learn. All right, so a little recap here. We've got US, UR, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, CS, CR, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. Now we're going to go through a couple examples that will hopefully clear up what I'm assuming to be a fair amount of confusion on this right now. I guarantee these examples will help clear things up. All right, so here's our example. Every time the upstairs neighbor flushes the toilet, your shower becomes very hot and you jump back from the water. Eventually, you jump back from the water whenever you hear the toilet flush. Maybe you've experienced this yourself. You're hanging out in the shower and all of a sudden it gets really, really hot. And that's because your neighbor flushed the toilet and the shower doesn't have any cold water for a brief second. And oh my gosh, it's scalding hot. All right, so let's break this down. Our unconditioned stimulus is the hot water. The hot water is the stimulus, and we don't have to learn that hot water doesn't feel good. It's painful. So the unconditioned response is jumping back when we are hit with hot water. We want to avoid that hot water. It's a painful stimulus, so we try to avoid it. So unconditioned stimulus is hot water. In the presence of hot water, we have an unconditioned response, which is jumping away from it. Again, this is not something we have to learn. We don't have to learn that hot water feels bad. That's something we inherently know. We reflexively know to get away from hot water. Now, the conditioned stimulus is the toilet flush. This toilet flush is initially a neutral stimulus. Initially, we don't respond in the presence of the sound of a toilet flush. But the toilet flush is paired with the presentation of hot water. The conditioned stimulus of a toilet flush gets associated with the unconditioned stimulus of hot water. So we realize pretty quickly that if we hear a toilet flush, there's a good chance hot water is about to come out of our faucet. So what happens? We experience a conditioned response. We jump back from the water whenever we hear the sound of a toilet flush. We have a conditioned response in the presence of a conditioned stimulus. All right, I hope that makes a little bit more sense here. An unconditioned stimulus gets paired with a conditioned stimulus, and we eventually have a conditioned response in the presence of a conditioned stimulus. And that conditioned response looks just like our unconditioned response. Let's do a couple more examples. An individual receives frequent injections of drugs, which are administered in a small examination room at a clinic. The drug itself causes increased heart rate, but after several trips to the clinic, simply being in the examination room causes an increased heart rate. All right, what are our unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response? Well, let's think about this a little bit. The unconditioned stimulus, that's going to be the thing that causes an unconditioned response. All right, I think I'm going to pause it here because I've got a leaf blower going on outside. I don't want to subject you guys to that. So we'll get through this example and then I will pause my recording here and start up again. All right, so unconditioned stimulus, this is going to be the injection of drugs. So in the presence of a drug injection, you are going to have an unconditioned response of an increase in heart rate. So an injection of drugs is not something that needs to be learned. It automatically causes us to have this reflexive response of an increased heart rate. Now, what needs to be learned is the CS and the CR. The conditioned stimulus is the room itself. Being in that small examination room eventually causes a conditioned response. Being in that little examination room means that we're about to get that administration of drugs, we're about to get that shot. So our body starts to respond to the CS just like it does to the US. So we start to have an increase in heart rate simply by being in that room. And that's exactly what we have here. The unconditioned stimulus is the drugs. The unconditioned response is our increased heart rate when injected with the drug. The conditioned stimulus is the examination room that we're getting those drugs in. And the conditioned response is an increased heart rate when entering that exam room. All right, I've got one more example for you guys, but that's going to have to wait for part 2. Because again, I don't want you guys to have to hear that annoying leaf blower in the background. All right, stay tuned